Tell the Soviets, Mr. Khrushchev said he will bury you. I don't subscribe to this point of view. It's such an ignorant thing to do. If the Russians love their children too, how can I say?
Hope you enjoyed that intro. That is one of my Cold War favorites from Sting. It's called The Russians. Urge you to possibly check that out, whether it be on YouTube or whatever social media you guys use. But the rhetoric and the lyrics, really, if you understand the Cold War, you'll get that song. Anyway, welcome back to another Eurocast here from Keystone Oaks High School. Today we're going to go over Chapter 28, Point 4 in Jackson J. Spielvogel's Western Civilization. And in this episode, we'll start with talking about the United States and Canada, which embarked upon a new era in after World War II. All right, the New Deal. Going back to Chapter 26, the New Deal was President FDR's solution to the Great Depression in the United States. And, this program left its impact on the United States, and the United States is still experiencing things that can be traced back to the New Deal. And firstly, it was a Keynesian. Remember, John Maynard Keynes, got to know him on the AP exam. It was his approach to really a government's ability to spend its way out of an economic slump by making numerous new programs. And it's relevant because it really contradicts the traditional Adam Smith-like laissez-faire approach that the United States government had traditionally used. So really the role, power, and involvement in people's everyday life in terms of the government, the government's role, power, and involvement in people's everyday life was significantly increased in taxes on the well-off, as well as for government programs for the less fortunate, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But, as a result of the New Deal, organized labor, thanks to the Wagner Act, became a mainstay. Organized labor after World War I, immediately after World War I, was kind of on the attack. They were on the run because they were viewed as being, communist and Bolshevik. Well, thanks to some of the New Deal programs, organized labor was here to stay, and it became a mainstay in the economy and in politics, traditionally pledging allegiance to the Democratic Party. Additionally, you have the early formation of what we're going to be talking about here, a welfare state, which is a liberal way of addressing crucial items like pensions for older citizens, aka Social Security, government housing to help the less fortunate, and government programs in general to bring electricity to places where it was unavailable. An example of that in the United States was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, if you will. And lastly, the New Deal had begun the early stages of a movement to bring civil and more equal rights for minorities. And FDR had actually appointed black members into government offices. In addition, New Deal programs encouraged writers to record and interview former slaves to accumulate their interpretation on historical events. And really, there was a concerted effort to collect history of those people that had, that actually were still alive, that had been slaves in their earlier life. And these changes were bolstered by the election of 3 Democratic presidents during this era, including, obviously, FDR, but Harry S. Truman, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the majority of presidents serving from the late 40s into the early 60s were, in fact, Democrat. Additionally, there was one Republican, and that was Dwight D. Eisenhower, but, really he was committed to a lot of these reforms. He wasn't a consummate right-winger. In fact, he really didn't have a party. The Republicans decided to recruit him. Both parties were recruiting him after World War II, and so he really wasn't overly conservative. And those programs that I mentioned of the New Deal and the welfare state were here to stay. Now, the 1950s in the United States is often referred to as the affluent society, or Happy Days, like the TV show. And this is because the economic boom that followed World War II created a situation of confidence, the complete and utter opposite of all of the shortages of the Great Depression and World War II. All of that stuff was over. Americans, for the first time, had disposable or extra income to spend on consumer goods. After the war, people wanted to feel good and provide for their families, and provide families, moms and dads wanted to provide their kids with things that their parents struggled to provide for them. The suburbs exploded as cookie-cutter housing plans like Levittowns popped up all over the suburban areas or surrounding cities. And we'll talk about this consumer economy in a bit. But the growth of labor unions, as I mentioned, as a result of the Wagner Act and the New Deal, also enabled many workers to obtain higher wages. And with their ability to obtain higher wages, they had the ability to buy consumer goods. So real wages grew about 3% per year on average during this era, which was the most continued advance in real wages before this era or since. Now, besides the economic affluence being a characteristic of the post-war United States of America, so was being deathly afraid of the spread of communism. In fact, the United States experienced yet another Red Scare rivaling the one it and many other European nations experienced immediately following World War I during the interwar years. Remember, this is what helped lead the way of people recognizing fascists as being a legitimate, a legitimate alternative to communism. So again, people were terrified of communism, Bolshevism, and the fact that these people wanted to take countries over. And as already covered, in 1949, China, the most populous, I should say, nation in the world, fell to Mao Zedong and his communists. Additionally, the Russians detonated their own A-bomb in 1949, ending the United States monopoly on atomic warfare capability. And in 1950, if you remember, communist North Korea invaded South Korea in an attempt to spread communism deep into Asian affairs. And as you can imagine, naturally, the United States freaks out. Now, there were rumors that there were communists everywhere. Factories, butcher stores, private businesses, on-street corners, or maybe even next door to you. Look outside your window, look at your neighbor. He might be a communist, just saying. Heck, some of you guys have never seen It's a Wonderful Life. Many of you have never seen The Sound of Music, so you might be communists. Let's think about this, though. We poke fun at it and we joke about it, but how do you think the Russians got the A-bomb technology? Just ask Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. I mean, there were Russians and communists employed in the Manhattan Project. They were here. Now, before you get too freaked out right now, remember, we had spies internally in Russia as well. So, as in every area, there is a societal phobia. When there's a societal phobia, meaning people are really scared about something and it's really freaking them out, demagogues emerge. Now, what's a demagogue? It's a dynamic leader who spits out half-truths about the severity of an issue and who also provide that they have the clear answer, the clear-cut plan to solve the impending crisis. These people emerged. You don't think I'm telling the truth? Remember, what did Mussolini say? What did Hitler say? Heck, what did FDR say? And again, those of you who have taken APUSH, what did Huey Long in the era of the Great Depression in the United States say? It always happens. They emerge. Well, the United States had a guy named Tail Gunner Joe. All right, again, a World War II vet, but Tail Gunner Joe was Senator Joseph McCarthy of the great state of Wisconsin. Hey, just saying, in PA, at least in the Cold War, we produced Marshall, the Marshall Plan, Uniontown, PA. Wisconsin has McCarthy, Edge, Pennsylvania, just saying. But McCarthy claimed to expose many communist conspirators. He created the HUAC, or House of Un-American Activities Committee, and basically it was a government committee with witch hunting skills. They went after many Americans. They just started throwing people down in the wake of saying that they were communists. And they went after celebrities in Hollywood. They went after radio and movie star personalities. A couple to name, Leonard Bernstein, the famous composer and conductor. Helen Keller, go figure. How can you pick on Helen Keller? But he did. Actor Charlie Chaplin, Frank Sinatra, Orson Welles, Danny effing Kaye. Anyway, that's Danny Kaye. That's a reference. I didn't swear there. It's a reference to Christmas Vacation. Relax. But Americans were shocked and glued to the new media outlet. Remember, this is the era where televisions were starting to be installed in Americans' homes, and they were glued to the television, hearing stories about communists from within. It was on this device that many new people learned about the overinflated communist threat from within, and eventually McCarthy went too far. When did he go too far? He attacked and accused the high command of the United States Army as being communist. And at that point, the public grew suspicious of McCarthy's intent and his evidence that he was providing. And finally, there was a backlash, and he was censured by the Congress in 1954, and the witch hunts, communist witch hunts, came to a close. Now, you got to also remember, people were terrified of Joseph Stalin and his policies following World War II, both in Europe and here in the United States. And as we learned previously in chapter 28 earlier, there was an effort by new premier Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s to de-Stalinize. So, and basically what de-Stalinization was internally in Russia to lessen the burden on the Soviet people. This less of a burden was one of the economic initiatives here was to concentrate less on heavy industry, as Stalin had done in his 5-year plans, and to focus more on consumer goods. Remember, the shift from heavy and military goods to consumer goods and agriculture through central economic planning was known as, in your book, Gosplan, G-O-S-P-L-A-N. And yeah, you need to know that. So Khrushchev was hell-bent on proving that communism was superior to capitalism. But he changed his tune. All right, Stalin died in 1953, and what Khrushchev comes about and starts preaching is something called peaceful coexistence, all right, with the West. In other words, a lessening of tension, if you will, and hostilities with the West. And if Russia could establish fewer hostilities and less tension with the West, he could focus internally on economic improvements to help the Russian people out. Examples of this new attitude and attempt at better relations with the West included an allowance for Austrian independence. The USSR agreed in 1955 to real independence for neutral Austria after 10 years. 10 years Austria had been occupied by the Allies following World War II. And so this was a positive step forward. The results were a significant reduction of Cold War tension in Eastern Europe, in that Eastern Bloc that everybody was freaked out about. So 55 to 57, some hopeful years, if you will, in reference to the spirit of Locarno prior to World War II. And additionally, there was a summit held in Geneva, Switzerland in July of 55. And the Russians met with the United States, Britain, and France to begin discussions on European security and disarmament. Sound familiar? The hopeful years. Washington Naval Conference, the spirit of Locarno. But nothing really was achieved here either. But the fact that there were talks was taken as a positive step towards peace. And maybe we won't nuke each other. Additionally, there were revivals of the arts. You know, somebody in class the other day said, you know what, you got to be scared when there's no art, when there's zero art coming out of an era or an area. And that was Russia, you know, during Stalin. You know, you didn't express yourself and tell people what your opinion was because you were afraid you were going to get Stalinized or crushed or killed, sent to a gulag. And two of the most important examples of Russian expression during this era were Boris Pasternak in 1956 when he released Dr. Zhivago. Great movie, but it was a book, and it was a story of an intellectual, a hero, a martyr, if you will, who rejects the brutality of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and rejects the brutality of Stalinism. What is his fate? He is tragically destroyed by the authorities. It's kind of a romantic / political ploy here, but the fact that it is published and read widely, even especially here in the United States, represents a step in a new direction for Khrushchev that, hey, we're going to tolerate some dissension. We're going to tolerate some different opinion. And additionally, in 1962, Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which portrays in gruesome detail the daily life in a Stalinist gulag where Solzhenitsyn himself was once a prisoner. So, again, here is a step in the right direction in terms of culture and art and tolerance under Nikita Khrushchev. Now, the Stalinist hardliners within Russia don't like it, and they're going to have the final say, just saying. But for now, it's peaceful coexistence. And it results in additional communist reformers around the Eastern Bloc and around Russia seeking greater liberty and national independence for their nation states within the Eastern Bloc. And the masses seemed ready to ask for more liberty also. So you read in Poland in 1956, riots break out as people go to the streets and demand reforms. Khrushchev responds with allowing the release of over 9,000 political prisoners in Poland, including previously Stalinist purge leader Władysław Gomułka. And, he managed to win more freedom and autonomy for Poland during this era. And it was kind of interesting. He was tolerated because he did allow more freedom and more reform, but in the end, he kept anti-Soviet feeling in Poland at bay. So thus, they were moderately allowed to reform. Now, this feeling of optimism spreads to other Eastern Bloc countries, including Hungary in 1956, where students and workers in Budapest installed a liberal-minded communist reformer as their new chief. His name was Imre Nagy. And this triggered a fervor of events in which Hungarians conducted huge demonstrations demanding non-communist parties be legalized. And additionally, more radical people became involved, and the protests and demonstrations turned into open armed rebellion throughout the country. A lot of people hoped that the United States would come to the aid of the Hungarians in the conflict and assist them. However, before that could happen, I'm not saying it would have happened either, but Soviet tanks rolled in to Hungary, followed by Russian troops, and they crushed the uprising. And they installed János Kadar. A firm communist control was established throughout Hungary. And at that point, really, Khrushchev kind of backs up from his leniency because he doesn't want to appear to be weak. And the Eastern Bloc obediently falls back in line with the communists. And in the 1956 meeting with Western ambassadors, Khrushchev makes the comment that you heard in the Sting song that I played at the beginning of this broadcast, "We will bury you," towards the West. And it stirs up tension and fear. So, again, secretly, this was an era of optimism, but it's going to come to an end. Because while Khrushchev on the outside looked like he was willing to let go of some of the Stalinist hardline policies, behind closed doors he was wooing nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America with promises of Soviet aid, even if they weren't communists. So tension was significantly about to mount. In 1957, things got downright scary. A Russian satellite was sent into orbit on a rocket and was brought back down safely into the Soviet Union. And this is a remarkable scientific achievement. It sent the message that the Soviets were ahead of the United States in terms of science and space technology. This freaks Americans out because, wait a second, you mean they're ahead of us? This begins what we know as the space race. All right, and obviously the satellite I'm talking about was Sputnik. And, some people start looking, and maybe Khrushchev was correct. Maybe the East was going to bury the West. And peaceful coexistence was drawing to a conclusion as Khrushchev demanded that the United States and allies leave Berlin. And in 1959, the Soviets and Americans had agreed to hold exhibits in each other's countries as a cultural exchange to promote understanding. This is still kind of peaceful coexistence. Maybe we can get along. Maybe we just need to educate each other about each other's habits and tendencies. And the Soviet exhibit in New York opened in June of 1959. In the following month, and by the way, in June of 59, Nikita Khrushchev came to the United States to visit. In the following month, Vice President Nixon was on hand in Moscow to open the U.S. exhibit to show people the ingenuity and know-how of the United States and their technology. And in an exchange, Khrushchev and Nixon get into an argument of whose system was better. And you got to look it up because it's pretty funny. But this is an example of this right here. Nixon's showing people in Russia, hey, this is what American homes, they have dishwashers and laundry facilities, washers and dryers. And Khrushchev just crushes them. And Nixon battles back, and they get into it. So, the Cold War's heating back up if you haven't figured that out yet. And another thing that threw things in after the kitchen debate was just in 1960, as another peace summit was about to begin between Khrushchev and outgoing President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a U.S. U-2 spy plane right here was shot down out of the sky over Russia. And this was done as the USSR was told by the United States, hey, we're not spying on you, man. Well, now they had proof. Khrushchev demands an apology from Eisenhower, and none comes. So the summit, another peace summit scheduled for Paris in 1960, canceled. Add to that, in 1959, that Cuba had fallen under the control of Fidel Castro under the watch of Eisenhower. Eisenhower approved the CIA operation to overthrow Castro by invading Cuba with a U.S.-backed force of trained guerrilla guerrilla soldiers. And under President Kennedy in 1961, this operation was carried out. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it failed miserably, and the United States didn't support the guerrillas with air support. It was an embarrassing moment for the United States and for Kennedy. Kennedy looked weak early in his administration. However, I liked how he handled it. He did own up to the failure and moved on from there. Furthering in this Red Scare, fear it spread, red is not dead, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to enforce Khrushchev's 1958 ultimatum for the Allies to leave, get out of West Berlin. And since then, 2 million East Germans had fled East Berlin into West Berlin from 1949 to 1961. So putting up this wall, ended the future crisis over Berlin, but it was a symbol of the end of the spirit of peaceful coexistence. And here you can see live action footage underneath the U-2 spy plane of them building the Berlin Wall. And then in 1962, in response to the United States trying to overthrow Fidel Castro, Khrushchev agrees to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to protect against a future U.S.-sponsored invasion. The Cuban Missile Crisis was in full swing by 1962 when Kennedy and the U.S. demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles and then proceeded placing a quarantine naval blockade around Cuba, preventing any Soviet shipments into Cuba. And the superpowers at that point were on the brink of World War III. People were going to the grocery store, not to buy toilet paper and milk like they do before a big snowfall, but, basically buying supplies to prepare for Armageddon. Luckily, the cooler heads prevailed. Khrushchev agreed to remove missiles from the island nation of Cuba in exchange that the United States would remove its missiles, aiming all over Russia, that they had installed and in place in Turkey. And also the United States had to agree, and we backed this, but never again would we invade Cuba. Now, the crisis was interpreted by the Soviet hardliners as an indication that Khrushchev was weak and needed to go. The space race and continued armament programs prevented any significant shift of the Soviet system to allow what Khrushchev wanted, which was increased agricultural products and consumer goods. So the agricultural projects backfired, the consumer goods projects backfired, and what this does is it causes a resurgence in conservative Stalinists taking over, and Khrushchev was removed from power by 1964, and a guy named Leonid Brezhnev becomes general secretary from 1964 to 1982. So some of that is some of the material that we really haven't gone over. I just wanted to get that to you. Now, that was kind of the 50s, all right? Now, the 60s in America is a decade of upheaval, as the book said. Again, many of the nation's problems were ignored throughout most of the 1950s. People just wanted to experience a good time. Hey, the war was over, the Depression was over. Let's let the good times roll. And but there were issues, and you can't gloss them over forever. And that begins the question: were the happy days really all that happy? So even in the 1960s, as it began with optimism, energy, and hope, the nation elected the youngest president in its history, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, beginning with a brief flirtation with an American political version of what they called Camelot. He had a good-looking guy, his wife, he had 2 kids. Everything was going great. The baby boomer generation had been one of the main forces of getting Kennedy elected, and loved his energetic message of not asking what your country can do for you, but asking what you can do for your country. That's what he preached. However, assassin and communist agitator Lee Harvey Oswald had something to say about this era as he ended it on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Now, the guy that followed Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, who won his own outright term in a landslide election in 1964, set out to build on Kennedy's popularity to create what he called his Great Society, which was a continuation of social welfare reforms, picking up where the New Deal had left off. It included Medicare and health care for the elderly, a war on poverty, complete with government assistance as weapons against poverty, and with food stamps. The Job Corps, Department of Housing and Urban Development, to deal with racial issues and issues of fairness and equality in U.S. cities. It also called for federal assistance in promoting education in both public schools and communities, and also with assistance promoting more students to enter college and higher level educational programs. LBJ, aka Lyndon Johnson, also pledged new efforts to provide equal rights for African Americans. The civil rights movement in the United States began in the late 1940s, actually, with President Harry S. Truman when he desegregated the Army. I believe that was 1946. That legislation was followed under Eisenhower's administration, where the Supreme Court issued the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954, which ended the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson that had been established in 1896. Essentially, boys and girls, racially segregated schools as of 1954 in Brown versus Board were unconstitutional. That wasn't the end. Obviously, there was a lot of other reforms that needed to happen in the South, as well as in northern cities. And coming out of this era was a Baptist minister by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. He founded the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and organized peaceful demonstrations, sit-ins across the South to end segregation on other public access points, public facilities, including buses. His most famous was the Birmingham, Alabama bus boycott. And in 1963, King led the March on Washington, where tens of thousands of Americans marched to protest unfair treatment of African Americans. This is the march where King announced his infamous dream for Americans in his I Have a Dream speech. So Johnson took up the cause of civil rights that Kennedy had actually started and pledged to help, and Congress helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it was followed by a Voting Rights Act that allowed African Americans to freely vote in the South without discrimination, threats, or intimidation. So again, a lot of demonstrations, thus the upheaval in America in the 60s. It's about to get even more interesting, boys and girls. The Great Society was far from a utopian answer to all of America's socioeconomic problems. In fact, there was really a great backlash against a lot of the changes in America at this time from the mid to late 1960s. Adding to protests for and against civil rights movement was America's continuing containment policy, which had prompted President Johnson, to escalate America's involvement in the conflict in Vietnam. African Americans took the gains made in voting rights and ending segregation in public places and turned to equality in employment opportunities as their next initiative. They also wanted the government to start looking at conditions in cities and urban areas where a lot of African Americans were stuck in ghetto-like conditions. More radical leaders who didn't agree with King's nonviolent approach start to emerge. These leaders, such as Malcolm X of the Black Muslims, gained momentum in a more eye-for-eye approach, and the result of this were the race riots in the summer of 1964 in Los Angeles. And in 1968 was a pivotal year in this movement where Martin Luther King Jr. was actually assassinated in Memphis. And after that, and following that, riots broke out in hundreds of U.S. cities, even here in Pittsburgh. Additionally, I don't have it on this presentation, but it just came to me, in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, two Olympic athletes were stripped of their medals, but if you remember, they, on the stand, put their fists up with black gloves, a symbol of black power, in a protest of all that was going on in the United States at that time. So it was a situation of upheaval, no doubt, in the United States. As we'll see, some of that upheaval actually spilled over into Europe. But now we take a break, and in the book they talk about Canada and the development of Canada. So many of the developments in the post-war Canada really mirrored a lot of the events that were going on economically, especially in the United States. Canada experiences strong economic growth, including in industry, and the United States played a huge role in the growth in Canada. With, in fact, a lot of American companies and American businessmen actually owned Canadian businesses. Some in Canada didn't like this. They feared playing a subordinate role or playing second fiddle, if you will, to the United States. They didn't want to just be yes men. They wanted their own identity. But the reality in a post-World War II political situation where you had the communist Reds and the Eastern Bloc in 1949, China becoming communist, Canada and the United States needed one another. Canada joined NATO in 1949 and also sent forces to back the United Nations and help the United States in defending South Korea in 1950. They also joined the NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. And the fact of the matter is the United States and Canada shared a special close relationship. Politically, the Liberal Party dominated Canada most of this time period, and under Lester Pearson, they created Canada's welfare state, complete with their own national social security system, and they took it a step further than the United States. They also approved a nationalized health insurance program, and all Canadians were covered and had access to health care and prescription drugs and such. Now, we take a step back and we start looking at a different aspect here of post-World War II Europe and post-World War II world. And in this section, we talk about the post-war society and culture in the Western world. And really, we need to talk about the structure of European society. There were major changes following World War II in Western society and culture between 45 and 65. There were major changes in the middle class in particular of Western countries. In fact, there was a rise or jump in the growth of the middle class during this era. And this rise in the middle class occurred for a few reasons. All right, the rapid industrial and technological expansion during the war and in the post-war era created large corporations in need of managers, scientists, researchers, and development. Additionally, the growth of these governments and welfare states that we're going to be talking about, the growth of government in general created more government agencies, and you needed people to work in these government agencies. You needed managers and scientists to make these government agencies work. So there was demand there. And the old propertied middle class that we've talked about throughout the year, they lose control of many of their family-owned businesses after World War II. You see less and less mom and pop mom and pop areas. This is the era of the growth of the supermarkets, and more corporate endeavors. Trying to think of what I could say today, but like Walmart. Even though Walmart wasn't around, it was kind of the beginning of that atmosphere where big companies were taking over smaller-owned family businesses. Top-ranking managers and civil servants represented the new model for the new middle-class salaried specialists. All right, they were well-paid, they were highly trained, they were more and more educated. And following the war, many middle-class families wanted to pass these opportunities forward for their children. So they encouraged, for the first time, more and more of their kids, middle-class kids, didn't go to work in the family business or in the mill. They were encouraged to attend universities for further training. Lower class structure changed also during this era. They continued to migrate from rural areas into cities, and the industrial working classes really during this era, even though we have industrial expansion and economic expansion, the industrial working classes ceased to expand while job opportunities for white collar and service employees, as we said, they grow exponentially. All right, so you're thinking, well, this isn't good. This is going to be a revolt, but not really, okay? They leveled off. It's not like there was a shortage. You could still work in steel mills. You could still work in coal mines. You could still work in factories. But, even though those job opportunities aren't expanding, at the same time, real wages are actually increasing. So, the jobs aren't expanding, but basically the standard of living for those people in these jobs are increasing. And what it's doing is it's giving more and more people disposable incomes. And stay tuned to that because it's going to be a big thing in the consumer economy. This allowed the working classes to aspire the same consumption patterns as the middle class. They wanted the sweet stuff, they could afford it, and they were going to go out and get it. And this is what led to what a lot of people call the consumer society. And you need to know this, all right? So what are the traits of the consumer society? The gadget revolution. I'd write that down. Europeans started for the first time buying. The United States went through this in the 20s, but Europeans started doing it after the war. They buy washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, radios, TV, stereos. This is where the rise in the automobile industry kapooms in Europe. Many of the people were able to purchase these goods due to the increase of installment plans or credit cards. Buying things with money you don't really have, you'll pay later. Supermarkets also emerge, and they also made buying everyday commodities a lot easier and actually a lot cheaper. So your money could go further. And the growth of these supermarkets coincide with families moving to the suburbs, acquiring cars, and let's face it, owning refrigerators, because you can't buy food in massive quantities if you don't have refrigerators. The stuff will spoil. And the best example of consumerism, and here's a question on your homework here, the best example of consumerism and the symbol of having arrived, if you've arrived in this era, that meant, ladies and gentlemen, you had a car. And by the 1960s, there were almost 45 million cars in Europe, where in the early 40s, there were only roughly 5 million. So that was a significant change for middle class and even lower class families. Leisure also marks a new transformation in this era. Leisure increased because industries required workers to work fewer hours. And as we said, they started paying their workers better, so they had more and more disposable income. Well, what do you do with that? You buy sweet stuff, you buy consumer goods, and you know what else you do when your work week is reduced from 60 hours to around 40 hours and you get more holiday pay? You know what you do? People, you spend your money. You go to professional sports games, and in Europe they go to soccer. It explodes during this time frame. You go to horse racing venues. You watch movies. You go to the movies. You buy TVs. You go to concerts. You go on vacation. So we have mass tourism during this era. The travel industry kabooms. Before World War II, traveling for pleasure was purely an aristocratic phenomenon. You remember the, what's it called? It was the Grand Tour that noblemen would send their kids on an expedition. See the world, go live it up before you get on with your life's work. Well, this is no longer just something that the rich can do, all right? Paid vacations were now required by law in many of the nations as a result of the establishment of the welfare state. And more people with more and more disposable income, businesses want to tap into that market. So they start offering reduced rates for vacations and travel plans, packages, and they open up opportunities for all people that flat out never existed before. I keep mentioning this welfare state, and you guys are probably thinking, Mr. Sig, what in the heck are you talking about? Well, I'm going to tell you right here. After 2 world wars, Western European nations started to seek more universal services to all of their people. Why? We'll get into that in a second, but what am I talking about? They wanted more employment opportunities. They wanted, if you couldn't find a job, unemployment and disability insurance. They wanted to establish Social Security systems and pension plans for the elderly. They wanted free or subsidized health care for not only their elderly people, but for all people in some cases. And they did so by redistributing the wealth and income. They did this by placing higher taxes on wealthier citizens. Interestingly, though, this welfare state was designed to be universal, not just aimed, like in the United States, at helping the poor and the old or the unemployed. In fact, that was the case before World War I. This was for everyone. The fact that this significantly reduced class tensions that had existed in Europe for centuries. There was aid for care and to help people care for their children. They allowed more economic opportunities for everybody, but also for children, so they could attend universities and higher learning institutions. many European countries had moved towards free tuition or modest fees for attending these universities. And we can look at this in many different ways politically, all right? If you're a conservative, you're thinking this is wrong. If you're a liberal, you're thinking right on, man. Or if you're like me, you're right in the middle. But let's look at it for what it also may have been. Europeans were sick of war. They were sick of World War I. They were sick of World War II. They were sick of the Holocaust. They were sick of communism just killing more and more millions of people. They were sick of the tension that led to the fear that this might happen again. They were sick of the fear of further wars created by situations that we've learned like imperialism, Nazism, fascism, communism. So what they really tried to do was, it was their attempt to create a happier place where maybe people would be just happy enough to avoid radicalism. And we'll evaluate the successes and failures of the welfare state as we continue through the remaining chapters. But there were a few definite results of this era. Okay, the welfare state increased the amount of money states expended on social services, there's no doubt. In 1967, government spending was around 17% of the GNP on welfare state programs. By the 1980s, people, it was 40 to 50% of the GNP. And some critics said that these figures produced a generation of people dependent on the state and government. The fact of the matter is that people, in many cases, liked a lot of these programs, and the leaders knew it. And it was political suicide up and through the 80s to curtail or slash these programs. But the liberal and conservative forces would clash once again in the late 70s and 1980s as stagflation became the order of the day and economies of a lot of Western nations approached collapse and disaster. So stay tuned. We got to talk about women, boys and girls. Women in review. The early women rights advocates. We've mentioned these women. Olympe de Gouges, Mary Wollstonecraft during the French Revolution demanded equality for women based on the rights, declaration, I should say, of the rights of man and citizen. And they even came up with the Declaration of the Rights of Women. In the late 19th and 20th century, Millicent Garrett Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst were important figures in the British suffrage movement. Don't forget Emily Davidson as well, stepping in front of the horse. Women first received the right to vote in Finland and Norway in 1906, and then in Britain, Germany, and the Soviet Union, and the United States after World War I. Women relegated to the home. They were relegated to the home in fascist Italy and Germany, and we talked about that. They were supposed to produce more and more fascists. And women finally got suffrage in Italy and France after World War II. Switzerland was the last to provide suffrage, believe it or not, in 1980. Let's talk about women and marriage and motherhood patterns. In post-war era, women continued to marry earlier and earlier. Western European culture once again emphasized the domestic role. Women should be in the home. And I put this, it's I Love Lucy. We had this in the United States as well. Every time Lucy tried to do something on their own, she screwed it up. Whereas during the war, it was Rosie the Riveter. But the typical woman in Europe, the United States, and Canada had children quickly after marrying. The average of only 2 children per family, or the nuclear family, was the norm. And motherhood occupied a much smaller portion of a woman's life than at the turn of the century. One of the reasons for this was birth control. Use increased, and oral contraceptives and other intrauterine devices. There were some transformations in the post-war Western world with women in the workplace. And by the 20th century, and even especially after World War II, there weren't many opportunities for women to make additional cash or earn extra income at home. A lot of those opportunities disappeared. And so, during the wars, we know, women participated, Rosie the Riveter here, in factories and, provided and produced a lot of the goods necessary to win World War II. So one of the developments with women after the war is that there's a lot of women that start becoming full or part-time wage earners to make a little bit of supplemental income outside the home once their kids are older. My grandmother, one of them worked at a drugstore. The other one worked at like a shop and save type of supermarket for years and years just to supplement the income. She had a little bit extra for her to do whatever she wanted. She played golf, she bowled, all those things. This rising employment of married women became a really powerful force in the drive for women's movements, furthering women's equality and women's emancipation. Rising employment for married women also became a factor in the decline of the birth rates across the Western world, Western civilization. People were having fewer kids and women were working longer. So this kind of leads us to the women's rights movement, and Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex in 1949. You need to know that. And it's really, we'll get into this in a little bit, but it's really existentialist ideas that she exuded in these books, or this book in particular. She argued that women were in essence free, but had almost always been trapped by particularly inflexible and limiting conditions. Only by courageous action and self-assertive creativity could women become free and escape the role of inferior, or the outlook of that they were other type of beings. And really, The Second Sex inspires a future generation of women's rights intellectuals like Betty Friedan, who we'll talk a little bit more about in chapter 29. Now, art gets crazy here, people. As you can imagine, as a result of World War II, many artists struggled to figure things out. One quote in the book was from a German philosopher, Theodor Adorno, and he summed it up. He said, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. How do you do that?" And Jean Dubuffet intentionally adopts a raw style of art to depict the atrocities from World War II and the genocide that ensued. He used children's art and the art of psychologically distressed people to kind of influence a new movement. It was called Art Brut. And it suggested, hey, no formal training. You know, this looks like somebody in my ninth grade classes, or maybe some of you guys in AP Euro could draw something like this, or maybe even better. Although if you draw this, I'm probably going to send you to guidance. But anyway, just saying. But he depicted Nazi sympathizers and members of the French resistance alike. Nobody was really off limits. Another development of the post-war Europe was that the United States becomes the dominant central hub of the art world, as many artists fled persecution in Europe even before the war, and they settled in New York City. So New York City replaces Paris as the artistic capital of the West. And one of the new styles was abstract expressionism. All right, and some called it action painting, and it was energetic and spontaneous. The best examples of this were indicated or illustrated through Jackson Pollock, and this one's called Lavender Mist. And paint seems to explode, enveloping the viewer with emotion and movement. This new style broke all conventions of form and structure. It was like nobody had seen before. And they were drip paintings with their total abstraction, and they were extremely influential with other artists. His inspiration were Native Americans and sand painters, and he painted everything with the canvas on the floor. The next development in post-war art and literature was pop art. And the 50s and 60s saw a new form of art called pop art. Andy Warhol from Pittsburgh, who began as a commercial advertising illustrator, becomes the most famous of the American pop artists. He adapted images from commercial art such as Campbell's and soup cans, and photographs of celebrities such as Marilyn Monroe, and they were mass-produced and were at odds with the painterly techniques of abstract expressionists. And you know, a lot of people have asked me over the years, what does this mean? Why is this art? Well, no, these are all famous people, people that are popular in pop art, and you know, images that people could relate to. And he used new techniques and technology, and you know, this was easy to produce. We talked about people with disposable incomes. People could buy this stuff; they could relate to it. They liked it. So it becomes a new type of art that's available in mass quantities to ordinary and every average day, not just Americans but Europeans. So Andy Warhol, and I don't know if you knew this, but Andy Warhol is actually buried right on the outskirts of Castle Shannon there in Bethel Park. Asked me that in class. It's pretty fascinating. But yeah, he's from Pittsburgh. There was also something called, in literature, the theater of the absurd. It was the most significant new trend in post-war literature. You need to know this. Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot is an example of this. And it is not by just circumstance here and coincidence that if you look at Godot, there's God, and there's also, Mr. Copper tells me, the German word for death. And this is kind of preceding existentialism, but it's a total different outlook on drama and literature and plays. And Waiting for Godot is a drama where two men wait for the appearance of someone, and the audience doesn't even know who they're waiting for. Obviously, the indication and the interpretation is that it might be for God, but the audience has no background information. Nothing in the play seems to be developing. It's just two dudes waiting around. And the audience is never told if what they are watching is real or not. It's not like traditional theater where suspense is maintained by, kind of getting the people to think, oh my God, what's going to happen next? The curiosity's killing me. But rather, what in the heck is happening now? This is the new theater of the absurd. And it was a period of disillusionment with ideological and religious beliefs. So really there's this sense of meaninglessness. And that is kind of what followed World War II. Now, the sense of meaninglessness continues into the movement known as existentialism and existence. All right, and it's caused by the two world wars and the breakdown of traditional values and the philosophy that reflected the anxieties of the 20th century. Two Frenchmen paved the way for this movement: Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. All right, that's how you pronounce those. Look them up in the book. And this movement is centered on the idea that God is gone. He's absent. God is dead. Death of God, though tragic, meant that humans had no preordained destiny and were utterly alone in the universe with no future and no hope. Sounds reassuring, huh? But existentialists believe that humans did have one source of hope, themselves, human beings. People could create their own values and give their own lives meaning. And only through one's acts can one determine one's values. Individuals true to themselves refuse to be depersonalized by their society. A philosophical theory or approach that emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of the will. Now again, just kind of re-listen to that or replay it or reread it. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Just as existentialism was an attempt to explain despair and the collapse in values that many people felt after World War II, the fact of the matter was religion was not dead. Remember in our last DBQ we had Karl Barth, and this was a new movement. He said religion isn't dead. In fact, there's an attempt to revive religion right here. Christianity had really been on the defensive, really, if you think about it, since the Enlightenment in the 18th century when we learned about that. And there was after the war an effort to bring new life to Christianity. And one example of this was Karl Barth. And he attempted to infuse traditional Christian teachings with new life reflecting the times. In numerous writings, he tried to reinterpret the religious insights of the Reformation era for the modern world. He felt opposite of the existentialists, that the sinful and imperfect nature of people meant that they could actually know religious truth, not through reason. Don't try to reason and justify it, but just accept God's grace. And that's how it was in harmony with teachings of like Luther and Calvin. The Catholic revival also was begun by Pope John XXIII. And in the Vatican II, he liberalized a number of Catholic practices, including the liturgy of Mass, was allowed to be spoken in the vernacular, like in English or in French, not in Latin. But overall church membership for all denominations was down well into the 1970s. Now the last slide is the explosion. We mentioned Warhol and pop art. Let's just talk briefly about pop culture. All right, since World War II, pop culture had defined the West. And really, when you think about it, our culture. History of pop culture is a reflection of the history of economics that supports it. With the developments of mass leisure, mass consumerism, disposable incomes, pop culture explodes during this era in the 50s and the 60s because people had disposable income to spend on items that they wanted to spend it on, items that they enjoyed. This is really where the book talks about the Americanization of the world. The United States in post-World War II has shaped the pop culture of the world, not just with Michael Jackson, but let's talk about the 50s and 60s. Look at these slides, for crying out loud. You have Frankie and Annette, the Mouseketeers, Elvis Presley shaking his thing. You got Dick Clark, the American Bandstand, and Little Richard, and the list goes on and on and on. Why did everybody know about this? Movies, man, advertising, TV. The U.S. had spread its wings through consumerism. Movies were the primary way for spreading American values and culture following the war, but television was on the rise. Television was another way Americans put their stamp and spread their influence throughout the world. In the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, they could buy American programs for 1/10 of the cost per viewer than if they produced their own. Now, only through the welfare system did that change when Britain started to establish a quota system, which allowed British broadcasting to catch up to American. Music was another form of popular culture. We had jazz, rhythm and blues, the blues, rock. Rock and roll changed the world. It all originated in the United States and developed its roots. It traced the roots back to our African American culture. And in the 50s, we produced the likes of Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Little Richard. These people are the people that inspired the Beatles in England and other British reformers who led the so-called British invasion of America in the 1960s. That was the explosion of pop culture. This takes you through the rest of post-World War II, chapter 28. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helped you understand what you read, or maybe you didn't have to read, you just got the answers. But nonetheless, a lot of these terms, a lot of these people, you'll be responsible for. So again, hope that helped. Thanks a lot. And until next time, I'll leave you with Sting, but I can't find it, so we'll do it next time.